Just anyone who's to come in. Okay, we're ready on the phone? Yeah. Okay, so just, I won't give a full introduction, but for the sake of those watching this on video, just to say we're now in the second session of this morning, and Professor Simon Conway Morris is our speaker. We're very grateful to him for coming along. He's Professor of Paleobiology here in the Earth Sciences Department in Cambridge University, and we'll hand over to him for the second session. Thank you, Simon.
Right, I've been given instructions to speak remarkably slowly. But the problem was that I saw in the lady's handbag a revolver. So I'll see what I can do, madam, as best as I can. Right, okay, well, thank you again. If we can have the lights down a bit, because it's up to you. I mean, it's how clearly you can see the slides. I don't mind that. Is that okay? It's okay?
No.
Lights off? Yes.
If we take the lights out, it means the DVD. I think loses value.
What?
Otherwise we can't see you on the DVD.
Yeah,
properly.
yeah.
Is that okay?
No,
You can still see the slides.
And they're not
Can
dimmable.
anyone see that that's not a baby on there? A pale baby.
It's a penguin, that's right, thank you.
Northern Hemisphere.
Correct.
Thank you very much.
Okay, we'll see how we get on, but it maybe we do need to drop them a bit. Yeah, if necessary, okay. So I've been talking a little bit about convergence, and bless you, in the context of convergence there are many fascinating examples, but I think most people, if they went on a starship and went to a distant planet, maybe 1,000 light years from here, landed on a planet with an ocean and with an atmosphere like ours, and then they opened the hatch and they saw this, they would be pretty surprised. In fact, they would probably think they were going in circles. But in fact, I'm going to try and persuade you that even something like this is not precisely what is likely to evolve, but something surprisingly similar may well be on the cards. But as a little bit of background, one of the main arguments, again, by most neo-Darwinians, especially Stephen Jay Gould, but by no means exclusively him, has been the emphasis on accidents of history which involve mass extinctions. And so, of course, one knows perfectly well that this is an impossibility, the domestication of dinosaurs. I should just say in parenthesis, and I apologise to Ard, but rather wickedly I call this this painting here the degree ceremony in Oxford. So all those dinosaurs, so yeah. There's Richard Dawkins. That's right. There's his mother. And why do we know this is impossible? Well, it's quite straightforward, because the geological evidence, as indeed many of you will be aware, is that 65 million years ago, on a June day, if that's of any interest to you, but on a June day, there's good evidence of that, by the way, which I'll tell you about if you'd like to know. An asteroid, and it was an asteroid, not a comet, hit the Earth with a velocity of round about 20 kilometers per second and released a stupendous amount of energy. And the net result of that for the dinosaurs was extremely unhappy. And the mass extinction of the dinosaurs is unlikely to be directly due to that impact. And in fact, there's a great deal of controversy as to why some groups appear to have survived with really little change, so far as we can tell. But other groups, including all the great reptiles, not only the reptiles on land, famously the dinosaurs, but also those in the oceans, especially the great lizards, the mosasaurs, and also those in the air, the famous pterodactyls and pteranodon, all of these went extinct. And therefore, the argument goes that because the ecology of the planet was basically wiped clean, then the reinvasion of these ecological habitats by the mammals, and as I'll explain in a moment, the birds, allowed a completely new direction of history. And so the argument goes, and we have evidence of this from the fossil record, for example, that had there been no mass extinction of the dinosaurs, then we wouldn't have, of course, the bats, which I've already referred to, reinvading aerial habitats. We wouldn't have had the reinvasion of the oceans by the great cetaceans, which are quite closely related to the hippopotamus, as it so turns out. And here we have some killer whales engaged in what's called spy hopping, just generally, etc. Very interesting group indeed. And most importantly, from the emphasis of Stephen Jay Gould in particular, we would not have had the evolution of the primates, and therefore we would not have had the evolution of the great apes, and therefore we would not have had us. And so it does seem to be that if this event had not happened, and after all we've no reason to think that it was anything but a cosmic accident, then evolution in terms of the emergence of humans would have been permanently derailed. And these mass extinctions occur periodically, and at any time, so it is argued, evolution might go in a completely different direction. Well, as it happens, I think historically the evidence for the mass extinction is overwhelming. The evidence for the asteroid impact is very, very fascinating, and I think is scientifically as secure as anything can be. It's a wonderful story, but I don't actually think it makes any difference at all. And the reason for that, let me just remind me where we are. Yes, that's fine. Let's just think of my slides. The reason for that, of course, is that we've got to remind ourselves that during the time of the dinosaurs, both the mammals and the birds had already evolved. They coexisted with the dinosaurs. So if you went to China around about 130 million years ago, you would have seen these magnificent birds here. Now, of course, you will see that they are rather different from modern birds because they've still got their hands fully exposed with claws, which of course is something which has since been lost. They've got rather extravagant tails, true tails, which again you don't see in living birds. So these are both warm-blooded creatures, and I'll come back to those, the significance of that in due course. But what I want you to imagine is now a different sort of counterfactual, whereby the asteroid misses. It's a beautiful June day. There's two brontosaurus going for a walk, and there's bright light in the sky, and one brontosaurus the other, what on earth is that? I have no idea at all. Off they go into history. What would happen in that counterfactual world? Well, presumably the world would still be full of dinosaurs. Fair enough. Especially the tropics, where they are effectively being a sort of cold-blooded organism. They would flourish, just as today the tropics are full of snakes and lizards and those sorts of things. However, there's another aspect about Earth-like planets which seems to be unavoidable, and that is the development of ice ages. Ice ages are due to a whole set of complex factors which I don't think are completely understood, but in part at least are the storage or release of greenhouse gases, and also the necessary accumulation of snow and ice to form the great ice caps. But in a counterfactual world, though the asteroid misses, we still go into an ice age. So in the temperate and polar regions of the planet, it'll be the warm-blooded birds and the warm-blooded mammals which I would think would have an evolutionary advantage. As I explain in a moment, it's a very substantial evolutionary advantage, amongst which is the tendency to evolve technology. And technology involves, amongst other things, advanced hunting, and advanced hunting means mass extinction, as has happened to many of the large mammals on the surface of the planet in any case. So in this counterfactual world, the dinosaurs are still doomed to extinction, this time by the mass extinction, but by overhunting, by advanced technology. So I don't think actually mass extinctions make any difference at all. They, in this particular case, they accelerate an evolutionary process. They bring it forward by, I think, about 30 million years. They might perhaps postpone it, perhaps, but I don't think they ever cancel. And it's when we come to look at the evolution of the birds that we have some very, very interesting parallels, convergences with the mammals. Now, to begin with, those of you who are familiar with the biosphere will be surprised to see penguins and horses in the same field. This is a little bit unusual. This, as you can probably guess, is not a zoo. This is the Falkland Islands, which, as any of you who are here or English, has a very special place in our hearts, as you probably know. But also the warm-bloodedness of the mammals, which of course includes ourselves, and the warm-bloodedness of the birds is completely independent. They evolved independently. It's convergent. But why does this matter? Well, the argument generally goes that if you want a large brain, that seems to be an advantage. It's got to be kept at a stable state, and to do that you have to have very, very precise regulation of body temperature. And the molecular mechanisms the bird uses is similar, but by no means the same as what we use. So that's an argument which is of some interest. Another thing which now begins to touch on areas which I shall just wrap up right at the end of the second half of this talk is to do with vocalization and especially singing. Now, singing actually in many ways is a very, very interesting phenomena. In the birds, it has itself evolved independently twice, maybe 3 times. But equally interestingly, the way that some birds learn to sing is strikingly similar to the way in which children learn to speak. They go through a babbling phase, they experiment with the sounds. And if you look at the neurobiology of singing in the bird, it is highly convergent with what we see in the humans. And once again, as you'll see from my general emphasis, you know, this is the way the world works. I mean, we shouldn't actually be terribly surprised. There will be singing objects, perhaps, and if they do learn to sing, then they'll basically learn to sing in the same sort of way. But if singing, in fact, is even now perhaps underestimated, I think this thing's called a grey-tailed wren. I should be able to remember. This is a paper published about 6 months ago. This little chap lives in South America, and it turns out that they have an antiphonal singing, which is the most complex bird song yet recognised. And I'm sorry, I meant to look this up before I came here. If I recall correctly, the red are males and the blue are females. It may be the other way around. But the point about this is that up to 7 birds can sing in perfect antiphony together. The males on one register, the females on another. Not only that, but in fact, they can sing, you know, continuous perfect antiphony for up to 2 minutes. But a bird can leave the song or join the song and comes in absolutely perfectly, you know, not without a glitch at all. And it's a bit of an unfair example because what they did, in fact, was they recorded these birds to begin with, and then they wanted to discover who was doing the singing and so forth. And then rather unfairly, this is the way animal behaviour people work, they then put loudspeakers and them singing back into the jungle, and there's all birds were all like, what on earth singing? Oh, you know, thing. And then they were able to study each bird and see who was actually doing the singing and so forth. But the reason I mention this is not only because it's a fascinating example of animal song, because it's something I'm going to come back to in due course, because I think actually it's touching on something of very, very considerable interest. Now, another convergence we see, especially in the more intelligent of the birds, famously the parrots and the parakeets, but also the crows, which I'll allude to in a different context in a moment, is that they engage in what we call social play. Now, social play is extremely important because although we tend to take it, especially as humans, especially in children, but if you're lucky, you can remain a scientist and play all your life, but and somebody will pay you for it as well. That's the amazing thing. That social play is very much part of beginning to enter a world of much more complex interactions. It's not restricted to birds and mammals, but what is fascinating is that there are various categories of social play, and in the most intelligent of the birds, it matches one-to-one the social play categories of the mammals. And amongst the most famous of these examples is this fascinating New Zealand parrot called a kea. I think it's pronounced kea or kia. And these are Kia? Kia, thank you. Here they've got the young, they have these tug-of-war games. They have this, in a way, our children, stop that, pull yourself apart, you know, thumping, Timothy, leave them alone, you know, beating the daylights out of each other. And as teenagers, the Kia goes around in delinquent gangs, trashing things. And here they're dismantling in an armchair. And they enjoy dismantling cars as well. Which I actually privately approve of, but that's another story. And so the aspects about these creatures is they are indeed playful, they are also very intelligent, they're also socially very complex. And one gets the sense here that, perhaps unworthily, maybe I'm making this too anthropomorphic, but once you start these sorts of engagements here, in a way you're entering a rather different sort of world which is both safe and dangerous at the same time, but is, as I've already stressed, convergent. But the most interesting thing of all, I think, and this is work which has really come to prominence in the last few years, is the tool-making ability of various birds. It's been known about for a long time, but what is now clear, especially in the crows, and most famously, this is a captive in Oxford, a very interesting group working there. This is a New Caledonian crow. And in the wild, what they do is they take bits of leaf and strip them into probes and hunt for insects. And correspondingly, they also get hooks, which they sculpture out of bits of wood, effectively, in a rather ingenious way, and use these also to probe into trees, searching for insect prey. Now, the point about this tool-making ability is it is clear that they do it from their own brains. They don't do it by imitation. They're also very innovative. But the most interesting thing of all is that in the wild, they have these long strips of leaves belonging to a plant known as a pandanus pine, and they strip out pieces of it. But the thing is, they modify them successively for different functions. And why this is so important is, effectively, as far as I can see, one can legitimately describe this as a proto-technology. And that's as it has been described by Hunt and Gray, the people who have studied this New Caledonian crow in the wild. And I think this is very fascinating for a number of reasons. First of all, so far as I can discern, the tool-making abilities of the New Caledonian crow are significantly superior to that of the chimpanzee. Second of all, which I think is even more interesting, is that people say, well, this is all jolly fascinating, but then you think about our tool-making abilities 2 million years ago, which is more or less when tools, 2.5 million years ago, when the first hominid tools first appeared. Now, it's more than likely that before that, other sorts of tools were being made and have not been preserved. But even so, when you look at the stagnation of the technology of primitive lithic cultures, one begins to wonder whether the difference between these is as much as we would like. And that's what I meant by the inevitable extinction of the dinosaurs. This is basically on the way, not, of course, as a spear, it's not a spear, but conceptually, one is on the way to making something which could be used for a mass extinction. And here in Cambridge in particular, but also in the States, and here in Cambridge, Nikki Clayton, who's a very, very talented animal behaviorist, has been studying the mental world, for want of a better word, of the crows and the group known as the corvids. And she's done fascinating work both on crows but also on jays and on rooks, and other people have been studying ravens. And effectively what they're arguing, and I'm very much persuaded by these arguments, is that, and the experts here in the audience, I hesitate to put it in such simplistic terms, but this is as far as my understanding goes. So far as there's a complex cognitive world of the great apes, one can divide it into ways in which one uses one's imagination, famously pulling the string. And in fact, I was told the other day where they had an experiment whereby there were 2 bits of string, one of which did not work and the other one did work, which crossed each other. The crow got it right straight away. It knew what it was doing. Taking things from one place to another, moving one's cache of hoarded nuts or worms, being flexible in your behavior, and working things out. And it does seem that the cognitive world of the corvids, the crows, is strongly convergent on the cognitive world of the great apes. They really are very similar indeed. And again, I'm slightly nervous about showing this in the presence of experts, but as I understand from my reading of this area, to be sure, the bird brain is, relative to the human brain, much, much smaller. But of course the animal is much, much smaller. But more interestingly perhaps, the structure of the bird brain is radically different from the structure of the mammalian brain. Radically different. In fact, this whole brain structure has been redefined a couple of years ago, and there were older ideas based effectively on a false evolutionary premise as to how the bird brain evolved. But the bird brain has what is referred to effectively as a nucleate structure, nuclei, as against the layered structure of the mammalian brain. And what I find so fascinating about this, and I may have misjudged this, is that to the first approximation, the same mental architecture, and so possibly, though this is extremely controversial, the same theory of mind, this is a very dangerous area to talk about, emerges from a brain which, at least in many ways, at macroscopic levels, has a very different architecture to what we see in the humans. And that too I find very encouraging, because it's a nice example of convergence based on difference, but maybe a hint that actually mental processes, wherever you are, at least if they're based on a nervous system, are really quite similar to each other. Well, this area of avian cognition, bird thinking, is extremely active at the moment, and also quite controversial. There is a sort of correlation between the intelligence of the bird and the size of its brain. It's a little bit mixed up, but by and large, brighter birds have bigger brains, so there are a few complications in it. On the other hand, again, going back to Stephen Jay Gould, I'm not trying to pick on him, but he was in many ways, well, some people say they're most articulate, but I stopped going to his lectures many years ago. That's another story. But in any case, he certainly went on at some length about evolutionary theory. And in addition to contingencies and mass extinctions, one of the other things he kept on emphasizing is that this trajectory of brain size increase in the humans from something which lived round about 4 million years ago, Australopithecine, in Africa, to, and I'm simplifying enormously here, to Homo erectus and related species, to ourselves. It could be that at the end of the trajectory, we can do algebra, Beethoven can write music for us, we can appreciate poetry, but Gould was insistent that this was effectively a glorious evolutionary accident. And I think, like the mass extinction of the dinosaurs, at one level, of course it's an accident. But in another set of perspectives, given the evidence for convergence, we can actually take a slightly wider view of it. But more importantly, Gould's emphasis and insistence was that this dramatic increase in brain size was a unique evolutionary event. Yeah, it might have been driven by a drought or shellfish or eating meat, lots of hypotheses, or social interactions, there are many ideas here. But on the other hand, it was something which was a one-off. But it turns out this is actually really not the case at all. And it turns out that if you look at the cetaceans, and especially the dolphins, then one has a very interesting example of convergence in terms of increase in brain size. And also, as I'll explain in a moment, it turns out that the cognitive world of this cetacean, this toothed whale, and this I've chosen a particularly magnificent example of a primate, but nevertheless this primate here are remarkably similar. But the brain size increase is quite striking for two reasons. I need to explain just in parenthesis that we have a brain which is roughly 7 times bigger than you would predict from the mass of our body. Bigger animals have bigger brains, smaller animals have smaller brains. But quite often, an animal has a disproportionately larger brain than you predict on the basis of the exponent 0.67. If you look at the increase in the brain size from Australopithecines, and I know it's not a linear thing, it's more complicated than that, you'll see that we have a fairly steady linear increase. And there's a lot of discussion why we had that increase. But what is so fascinating to begin with is that you'll see that the relative brain size of these dolphins and this porpoise here are such that our brain size only moved past the dolphin brain size around about 1.5 million years ago. Now, this is a time when we may even have had fire and certainly had relatively advanced stone tool cultures. Before that, the dolphins had the biggest brains on the planet. The second aspect which is interesting about this, though of course you can't tell it from this diagram, is that the fossil record suggests that this increase in the brain size of the dolphins may have been achieved some 15 million years ago and has been maintained for that time in some species. And the reason why this is so important is, first of all, there is a suggestion that the increase in the brain size in the dolphins was triggered by an environmental change, and that may be the case in humans, possibly. But also because although our brain is very large, it's even larger if you consider the amount of metabolic energy it consumes. Roughly 20% of your breakfast is feeding 2% of your body mass, which is your brain. So this thing is a furnace. It's consuming energy. And all things being equal, one could say, well, if you're going to be roaringly hungry all the time, in times of starvation, this is not a very good strategy. Better to be a bit more stupid and survive. But quite evidently, there are advantages with large brains. And you see this in the humans, and I think you see this in the dolphins. So there's some very interesting parallels. But in particular, there are a number of aspects, and sorry, this is taken off the web, so it's a particularly disappointing photograph. Even tool making is shown in the dolphins. In Shark Bay, there's a very interesting population, Shark Bay in Australia, excuse me, and what the females do is they root up sponges and stick them onto their schnozzles, onto the front of their head. And why do they do this? Are they looking attractive? No, probably not. They are looking for prey in the seabed, and the prey includes not only the things they want to eat, but such things as sea snakes and stonefish and various venomous animals, which, if you've ever been bitten on the nose by a venomous animal, is extremely painful. So this seems to be acting as a natural glove to protect the dolphin from that sort of unfortunate occurrence. So even tool making is achieved by a group of animals without hands. But more particularly, from what we understand about the cognitive world of the dolphins, they too have a brain structure which surprisingly is different from mammals such as ourselves. They actually have a really very different evolutionary history. And also, as importantly, they're living in a completely different environment. It's an aqueous environment, they're using echolocation, and in many ways they are more different than the tree-living crows and our tree-living ancestors. And it's encapsulated by this super photograph here. This is taken by Brenda McCown, a colleague of Laurie Marino, who has done extremely interesting work on the cognitive world of the dolphins. And one of the things they like to do is out of their blowholes, they like to blow these bubbles, which they manipulate and fool around with. They're also very sort of playful. But in many respects, both their ability to memorize things, their ability to understand communication, such that you can give them a series of instructions by hand signals, for instance, and they'll do one thing. Then you can use exactly the same hand signals, but in a different order, which means a different thing, and they'll do the right thing. So they can reorganize these semantic meanings into a syntactical context. At least that's what it appears to be. And also, the dolphins, a bottlenose dolphin in particular, is one of the very, very few species on this planet outside the humans which can recognize themselves in a mirror. And again, that's, we take all this for granted. It's very difficult to back away and think, how could you be so stupid? Why can't you see things? It's so simple. But only very, very few, only a handful of species can do that. And that aspect of self-recognition, if that's what it is, and tests do seem to be very convincing, are part, if you like, of this ability in the same way as social play of beginning to enter literally a different sort of universe. So the dolphins, although they're still mammals, are actually intriguingly similar, I think, in a number of respects to ourselves. Now I must just keep an eye on where I am, not get too excited. Right, I'm going to skip the next two slides because of the time. And it's a good story, but I was going to talk a bit about social convergence, but we can return to it if necessary. I really want to get towards some of the other conclusions. So I think you can see many, many fascinating examples of convergence, which encompass everything from enzymes to the social systems, which I would have talked about if I had time, to what seem to be the cognitive worlds of at least some vertebrates. I've not talked about the octopus. There are some very interesting studies which again suggest that there may be more convergences there than has been thought. But having said that, one has to say, well, these days as humans with language, we are different. We are animals, of course, but we are more than animals, and I don't think there's any dispute about that. And I like to encapsulate it with this particular photograph here, and more or less sort of put the question, what other species would think this is a sensible thing to do? I mean, like these clowns climbing up rock face with chalk dust, or people doing high altitude gliding. Oh, God, you have to give it, people who surf across the Atlantic, whatever. They were totally bonkers in some ways, but there is something extra there, which you can see the roots of course, very much in animal architecture, and indeed, at least now in the crows and possibly the dolphins, they may be more human than we are sometimes prepared to admit. But we've gone through another threshold. But here too, there are some interesting examples of convergences which suggest that what has usually been regarded as effectively just a fluke of history may in fact be something which is inevitable given the sort of world we live in. Now, the evidence at first sight seems to be a little bit of special pleading, but I think it's not. It involves the famous Neanderthal man. Now, this is a separate species of hominid. It's regarded as a separate species on the basis both of ancient DNA. So here we have the skull of a Neanderthal, and here we have a skull of our own species. So this is Homo sapiens. This is Homo neanderthalensis. And the fossil record suggests that probably the common ancestor may have lived as long ago as 700,000 years. perhaps. Neanderthals, of course, are extinct. They died out roughly 30,000 years ago. Unlike Homo sapiens, which has spread to all parts of the globe now, in the case of Neanderthals, they are restricted effectively to near Europe-Asia, sort of Ukraine area, and Europe itself. And to the first approximation, the Neanderthals have been regarded very much as runners-up. But that may be an injustice. We know from the study of Neanderthal sites that they had fire, they had quite advanced stone tools, they almost certainly had clothing because they lived in subarctic conditions, and there's also very good evidence of deliberate burial. This is the famous Kebara burial in Israel, and you can see there the lower jaw. The skull is not there and presumably was removed for a reason. Here's a reconstruction of a Neanderthal burial. It's pretty circumstantial, but in one famous burial site in the Shanidar caves in Iraq, there is evidence perhaps of the use of flowers, perhaps. It's pretty dodgy evidence, but there is evidence in any case. Now, why this species engages in technically inhumation burial is complete conjecture. It could be a number of reasons. We have no idea whether these people had any particular status or anything else. There is very restricted evidence for grave goods. There's a little bit, but it's much less than what you see in Homo sapiens. But nevertheless, despite these things are tantalizingly close to being fully human, but have been regarded, in a sense, as failures. And what is most interesting is that in Europe, about 35,000 years ago, that is fairly shortly before their disappearance, there is a cultural revolution in Neanderthal artifacts. And this is known as the Chattelperronian cultures. They have a number of names depending which part of Europe you're in. And of course it wasn't found by like this, but this is unquestionably the product of Neanderthal technology. So that you've got incisions in teeth and bones or drilling, and it's been reconstructed here as a necklace, and that seems to be reasonable. Now, whether it was used for sexual ornamentation, or whether it was used for something akin to shamanism, if they had shamans, who knows, we have the foggiest idea. But the general argument has been that on the basis of this technology, it can only be explained because at about that time, Homo sapiens, our species, is moving into Europe. So basically the Neanderthals are sort of taking the bushes apart. See what he's doing, he's making a necklace. And then they either shamble out and trade, if that's possible, or more plausibly they imitate. And there's nothing wrong with imitation. Actually, we do a great deal of it. A great deal of science actually depends on imitation as well as genius. So, that's part and parcel of being human. But there is a real possibility that this Chattelperronian culture is convergent. It's completely independent of Homo sapiens. It depends on some arguments to do with the stratigraphy of cave infills. It also depends on some extremely contentious arguments about radiocarbon dating. But if this Chattelperronian culture and other evidence of humanness in a separate species are correct, then it does suggest to me that by the time you get to a certain level of organization, then the development of all these other things is effectively an inevitability. And that's not actually very surprising, because after all, if we see now what we know about the cognitive world of the New Caledonian crows, they don't bury their dead. But on the other hand, there's plenty of evidence that other animals have some understanding of what death is. They don't understand it any more than we do, really, but nevertheless, there is, if you like, an evolutionary substrate out of which various other inevitabilities, including technology and ultimately extrasomatic structures, like St. Paul's Cathedral, will also be part of your evolutionary story. So that, I think, is a very, very interesting perspective on how we should not be surprised that eventually not only will you have a technology independently evolving, but quite possibly things which go very close to the human heart. Now, I just want to wrap up with a few sort of observations, such as I can. And the first is, as I keep on emphasizing with regards to neo-Darwinism, I'm, as indeed I think practically all biologists are fully signed up neo-Darwinian. I think that evolutionary processes are very well understood. I don't suppose we understand everything, but we never said we would or that we could. But I also wonder whether, in a certain way, there are some aspects of Darwin's genius, the study of evolution, which have been relatively neglected. And I'll just touch on a few of these before we finish. The first is, and this is a simple thing to say, but quite difficult to describe, in my view, at one level, we have not got the foggiest idea what life is at all. Of course, we know what it is because we're alive. We understand a very great deal in this particular case of a laminid shark. It's got a fabulous story of convergence with a tuna. Fascinating, absolutely brilliant in terms of not only the hydrodynamics of movement, but also in which the way in which the tail flicks this animal through the water with amazing efficiency. And it's the same solution arrived at completely independently. I've talked about the camera eyes. If we looked at the biochemical level, as I already mentioned, if you look at an individual cell, that as a molecular factory, in terms of the concentration of the various compounds, is far beyond what any of us could conceivably achieve for the foreseeable future. It's a product of evolution, but nevertheless this thing is completely integrated into something which we can also describe as beautiful. So that's fine. I'm not saying I am not a vitalist here, by the way, in case anybody wants to ask me about that. It's not a question of that at all. But nevertheless, it does seem to be that life has its own sort of integral form and its own cohesion. And although we can understand many of the roots whereby it evolved, actually how this thing coheres together, even from the point of view of embryology, is something which we do not understand at all well. I say it's not a mystery, but it nevertheless is this very curious thing where it is, well, the usual phrase is on the edge of chaos or whatever, but it's something which is, extremely precisely balanced between something, as soon as this thing dies, whoops, I'll go back, as soon as this thing dies, it will disintegrate within a few hours, but on the other hand, it could function for 40 years. Pretty impressive. Another aspect, which I think has already been clear from a number of the things I've stressed, is that we radically underestimate animal mentalities of one sort and the other. This actually opens a very interesting question indeed about what the origins of mentality are. It touches on that graveyard of ambitions, how do we understand consciousness, which I'll come back to in my own amateurish way in just a moment. But one can just describe it, quote, as an emergent property, and such it may well be. Quite what that means, I'm never myself terribly clear, but I have little doubt that dogs are conscious. Some people say they're not, but it seems to me the evidence is more in the other direction. Are frogs conscious? Probably. Amoeba? I don't think so. But on the other hand, if you see some of their relatives, called the ciliates, and you see that the way they behave, and one of their other relatives has even, as a single cell, has evolved an eye, which focuses light on a receptive area. It's pretty impressive. So is that conscious? And this may open up into discussion, but one can just simply say, well, this is emerging levels of complexity, and that is probably the simplest explanation. But one then wants to step slightly back and say, well, how is it not only are we conscious, but the sorts of understandings we arrive at, the intuitions and the inspirations we enjoy, the fact that we find beauty, for instance, in music and those sort of aspects. Now, these may all just be the product of a deracinated ape. Maybe simply we're trying to make sense of a meaningless world. But you can actually step back and say, well, you could be, if you like, what we call a panpsychist. That is, that ultimately everything is conscious. Stones are conscious. It's a very old philosophical tradition. They can't articulate their consciousness, but nevertheless they have a rudimentary consciousness. And this sounds, from a scientific viewpoint, completely stupid. But I think actually its weakness lies in philosophical arguments, not in scientific arguments. Another view is to actually say, well, when you begin to become conscious and sentient, not only are you making new worlds, but you're actually finding new worlds. And there's perhaps a little bit of evidence from that, from some recent discoveries. And the discoveries come from this fascinating occurrence on the Indonesian archipelago, famous for Java Man. Here's our friend Homo erectus and his chums living up in near Beijing, our Peking man. And there are many other hominid discoveries here. But on the island of Flores, as indeed, I'm sure many of you know a good part of this story, a new species of hominid sensationally was discovered a couple of years ago, and has an age range of roughly around about 100,000 years to around about 18, maybe 12,000 years ago. So what's all this about? Well, this is kind of fun, because here we have the two skulls. Here's a skull of us, this is Homo sapiens, and here is the skull of this Flores hominid, and there to give you in a way a more graphic idea. But this is not the skull of a child, this is the skull of an adult. This brain size of the of Homo floresiensis is equivalent to a chimpanzee. It's a very small brain indeed. Now there are various arguments about whether this in fact is some sort of aberration, what's called microcephalic dwarfing, for example, but there's evidence, good evidence against that. And there's also good arguments and interesting arguments about why these hominids became so small, because these hominids basically stood round about a metre, a yard in height. And yet despite that, there's evidence that they had fire. There's been some very interesting evidence just published that the stone tools they made really were made by them, and they evidently hunted as well. But despite all that, they've got a brain size little more than a chimpanzee. And they coexisted with Homo sapiens, so far as we can tell. And in fact, a colleague of mine here in Cambridge, I better not give his name because I want to retain his friendship, has suggested, in point of fact, he said, you know, typical Cambridge conversation, oh, don't worry, Simon, we've got an explanation for that. You see, these little chaps here, do you know what they were? They were servants, oh yes. They were the ones who used to go around with gin and tonic and glasses of wine, saying, you know, gin and tonic, sir? Wine, madam? Thank you, madam. Anything else? Your bed's being made up, madam. Good night, madam, and so forth. A very wicked thought indeed. But for whatever reasons, they did go extinct. But what is so fascinating about these creatures is that if you look at what's called the endocast, that is the internal mould of the brain of this hominid here, there's been detailed study, this is a side view of the brain, that there are various lobes here, and I'm not the specialist in this area, this is a paper by Falk et al. In Science a couple of years ago, to suggest that although these things are not completely Homo sapiens, they're actually probably derived from something like Homo erectus, they would have the full cognitive architecture of a Homo sapiens. So the brain size reduction doesn't in any way sort of, in a sense, reduce their mental aspect. Now, it may well be there are other ways one can explain that, it could be, but it opens to me a very interesting prospect that, in part, if we're ever going to understand our consciousness, and others I'm sure will disagree with it, if you think it resides solely in our brain, then we may never have the explanation we're looking for. Now, why should we think that? Well, this is entering into metaphysics. It's a science of a sort, but it's ones which are taking it far beyond the normal code of naturalism. I talked about the convergence of singing in the birds, but singing is convergent elsewhere, most famously in some of the whales. And amongst the whales, the most celebrated example are the humpback whale, and the male humpback whales sing. Long, long songs, go on and on and on and on. And it's not really known why they sing. There's been a lot of arguments, and I'm not up to date with those. It's probably got something to do with sexual selection and other things, but it's not clear that explains everything. What's interesting about this singing, as was pointed out by a musicologist working in the States, Gray and her colleagues, they had a fascinating paper in Science, and they were pointing out that this convergence is really very striking because it entails things which are not just music, but similarities to human music, including invention and melody, harmony, inversion, riff sessions. And you can say, well, it's all very well saying that's convergent because you only make sounds in certain ways by vibration of air columns and so forth. But on the other hand, this is an appreciation which goes deeper than that. And they said, well, we can actually look at this in a slightly different way and say the convergence is fine in terms of a biological explanation. But supposing, and this is the thing which caught my eye straight away and I found extremely fascinating, in a way we'll go back a little bit to the question about Platonism, but not so much Aristotle, I think, is they said, well, supposing there's a universal music, quote, out there. And in that sort of sense, of course they're convergent, because they've all found the same music. There is only one music, so that's why we have convergence. And that, to me, seemed to be a very, very interesting possibility indeed. And something which I think actually gives us some clue again that the matters with which we are involved are far more interesting, actually, have got far more moment to them than you know, the rather sort of dreary world picture which we're being peddled all the time. Oh, that's all there is, we're all going to die, etc., etc. And if that is true of music, then I don't particularly see why it shouldn't be true of religion. Now, obviously, here we enter even more dangerous ground. and I can happily justify that as best I can from my own perspective. But nevertheless, it does seem to me that the religious instinct of humans arguably is convergent through the Neanderthals. We'll never know, I think. But on the other hand, there are very many fascinating parallels in the emergence of similar moral systems in many different parts of the world, which quite clearly have not been in any direct contact. And you can explain that, again, at one level, to a certain degree of satisfaction, simply in the necessary maintenance of society and well-being. But on the other hand, you are entitled to say, well, if you're actually making contact, and here one's language begins to fail, but if you're beginning to make contact with other realities, which of course in their own religious traditions are perfectly familiar, then you can begin to understand how it is that we are indeed human. So, and aware, of course, that this is going into areas which are very, very controversial indeed. What I just want to finish with very quickly is to just try and say, not how do we understand consciousness. I haven't got the foggiest idea at all. I've no doubt, I know there are explanations, but I think it's fair to say that to date, if there is a graveyard of ambitions, if it's not studying the origin of life, it's trying to understand the origins of consciousness. Maybe we're just asking the wrong questions. There are people like Mary Midgley, for instance, who I respect enormously, who regard it effectively as just an emergent necessity of sensory perceptions. I hope I'm not traducing what she's saying. And then, of course, we have the brisk and breezy sort of confidence of people like Dennett in particular, who have sort of clapped their hands but mysteriously have persuaded nobody else. But there we go. They may yet be onto something. It's something which I find sort of fascinatingly difficult to understand. But one thing I think we can do from the scientific perspective, which is a legitimate part of the exploration, is to inquire what we can understand, not only in other animals, as I've been mentioning with respect to the convergence in crows and dolphins, but also in our own history. And here there are a few pointers, perhaps, which are both encouraging and discouraging. But here we've got some endocasts of Australopithecines. So these are the brains, basically, of primitive hominins. So there you can see, okay, you see the eyes there? Okay, those are the eyebrow ridges. There's a nice story to do with those. This is the front of the face, and here's the brain at the back. Now, I'm not even a specialist, I know nothing about this. But my understanding from the study of these endocasts and the relative size of the brain, which, remember, is the same as those chaps from Flores, effectively, is that it's unlikely that they had language. In essence, one's got to say, supposing we had a time machine, and we went back and collected some of these chaps from Africa, 4 million years ago, would we put them in a zoo? What would we do with them? Now, this is, I think, not a trivial question. What have we got here? And this is something those of you from America will recognize immediately, the sturdy American with his Davy Crockett hat and, of course, his rifle. But other things are clearly different. Why is it being attacked by a saber-toothed cat? Convergent, I grant you. And more particularly, why is this Australopithecine just outside Pennsylvania rushing to his assistance? A very fair question. This is actually the cover of a fascinating counterfactual science fiction novel by a chap called Harry Turtledove. And I only got to know about this because he very generously sent me a copy of several of his books because I have this interest in counterfactuals. And I read this with great pleasure. But it poses a question, and this is completely hypothetical, but says, and we know it wasn't like this, but supposing that North America, or the Americas, actually because of the Panama Isthmus, had never been colonized by humans. That's actually unlikely for many, but supposing they hadn't. But supposing that the Australopithecines had got there. So what happens, round about 1550, Europeans turn up in North America, and there on the shore are the whole crowd of Australopithecines looking at them. So how on earth do you deal with something, a species which is in the process of becoming sapient? What sort of reaction, relationship, understanding do you have with an animal or a human which is on the way to becoming yourself? And I think the way that Turtledove deals with this exploration is extremely interesting, but it's a pretty grim story because basically 400 years down the line, these chaps are being used for experiments on HIV, which of course is exactly what we do with would like to do in certain cases, thank you Colin, on chimps and gorillas and so forth, for the very best of reasons, I'm sure. And that I find something which would be well worth trying to explore in a little bit more detail. And there are a few things we can say from the fossil record. To begin with, if we look at Homo erectus, and this is simplifying because the story of human evolution is more bush-like than a lineage, we go Australopithecines through to Homo habilis, through to Homo erectus, through to Homo sapiens. There's much more to it than that. And this is a fantastic skeleton, the so-called Narukatomi boy, which I think is something in excess of 1 million years old. This is an almost complete skeleton. Yet, even at this stage, round about 1 million and 1.5 million years ago, there are at least 2 lines of evidence to suggest that although in many ways these hominids are strikingly human, they arguably are not completely human. And the lines of evidence are at least twofold. There may be other ones I'm not aware of. The first is, and this was pointed out by Alan Walker, he wrote a very nice book with his wife Pat Shipman called The Wisdom of the Bones, which I really recommend. It's a nice read, and it's all about the discovery of this skeleton. And Alan and Pat themselves are charming individuals. They work in Penn State in the States. So here we have the vertebra from, if you don't mind me turning your back to it, it's just about there. It's the thoracic vertebra of a human. And as you can see, this is where the spinal canal goes, which of course goes then all the way down to the base of the spine. This is the equivalent vertebra from Homo erectus. And you can see that the space for the spinal canal is much constricted in comparison with the space in Homo sapiens. And the argument which they use, Walker and Shipman use, is that because language requires a number of things, famously the descended larynx, which is convergent, by the way. You find that in deer, for instance. But in addition, you need very precise control on breathing from your lungs. And they suggest that one reason to think that these hominids did not have language, at least anything we would understand as language, is they simply didn't have precise enough control, as inferred from that spinal canal. That's intriguing. They got a tool culture. They might have had fire. They looked after their ill. But were they human? And then the second line of evidence, which actually I find even more interesting and convincing, is that from Java, this one skull of a child of Homo erectus, Mojokerto, I hope that's the correct pronunciation, was found. And what we see here are the trajectories in the increase of the brain size of humans in blue and chimpanzees in green. Humans have a slightly longer gestation period than chimpanzees, but chimp brains grow very, very quickly and then flatten off, whereas, as you'll know from all of you have had children, as their brains get larger and they get nicer by and large, then the increase is a very different trajectory. But what's so interesting is that the Homo erectus child skull falls on the chimpanzee line, not on the human line. So that too, it's not proof of anything per se, but is indicative possibly that it's more ape-like than human-like, surprisingly late in Earth history. So from that perspective, we really are not terribly well informed at the moment about, in the sense, when we become completely human. But if you actually again step back slightly and say, well, if you're interested in engaging not necessarily with Platonic archetypes, the point raised in the earlier part of the discussion, but the fact that ultimately one is living in a world, and I use world in a philosophical sense, I hope, in a much wider world than the naturalistic agenda specifically offers to us, which it seems to me, quite frankly, has run out of things to say now, then you can see the way in which a scientific program ultimately is allowed to engage in a metaphysical debate. It's not a question of rights and wrongs, it's a question of exploration. I mean, so far as we have some clue of this, it goes right back to what we understand about the origins of language. And here I'm very influenced indeed, as many people have been, not least J.R.R. Tolkien, by this individual. This is Owen Barfield, and I'm sure a number of you will know his works. In fact, it's likely you know them much better than I do. But one of his books has received a very large amount of attention by a very small number of people, and this is called Poetic Diction. And in essence, it seems likely that a good part of Tolkien's theory of language, which was integral to the construction of The Lord of the Rings, which I still regard as a very, very extraordinary book indeed, despite the hype in some areas. And Barfield, so far as I can capture in a couple of minutes before your tape runs out, is to look at the way in which words did not emerged simply as grunts, you know, that was, that's a tree, that means sky, whatever, was actually initially there is effectively a Platonic language whereby a single word meant a vast number of different things, which from our perspective, because we have divided things so much, especially scientifically, is a necessary part of the process of understanding. But if you look at the etymology of certain words which originally might mean, for instance, both wind and spirit, or other words which might mean iron, or other words which might mean fire, those effectively were encapsulating a much broader understanding of the world than our far more dissected approach to language at the moment. It's very difficult to put this across succinctly, but it's captured very well in an interesting analysis of Tolkien's writings by Flieger, Verlin Flieger, called Splintered Light, where what happens is that what was originally a single meaning, this comes out very clearly in one of Tolkien's poems about the mythos, is actually something which then in certain ways allows a greater precision of understanding in a local context, but the mythology of our world then effectively evaporates or is lost sight of. And it does seem to me that really the only way my sense of understanding humans and theology and various other things is likely to evolve is if we start to take these invisible realities as seriously as some of the visible realities. And so, from my own perspective, especially speaking now, and I'm quite happy to profess my faith as a Christian, therefore you'll already realise I'm hopelessly biased and medieval and stupid. If one then goes to the great domes, for instance those in St. Mark's, San Marco in Venice, and then one sees a depiction of this is normally derided as a sort of series of fairy tales and a sort of attempt to sort of understand things in a sort of pathetic, inarticulate, medieval and dull way. Maybe so. There's another view, in fact, when you suddenly realise the light here is too bright and you can't even look at it. So on that I shall finish, and thank you very much for listening to me.
Thank you, Simon, very much indeed for that. And I know, I'm sure that's stimulating my view of questions.
Need the mic?
Yes. Okay, we're going to have the mic for questions. So, who wants to ask the first question in this session? Really from all this information. Yes. Question over here. We're going to carry on from where we left from the end of the last session. So, mic's coming over.
I will not repeat my other question about proteins, but I want to remember here about natural selection that cannot apply before it has a function. Secondly, because your main area is paleontology, I would like to ask about it something. As far as I know, I think I want to say that one of the most important problems of the paleontology was probability versus fossil issue, I think. For example, I think it lasts from Darwinian time. Darwin talked that evolution mechanism was with micromutations, and it was small. So according to that, there should be many fossils. And Darwin said that we didn't explore Earth as much that we can find them fossils, and so he was, in some sense, thought that his idea was legitimate. But on the other hand, from the beginning, Huxley had a maybe saltationist view, and he saw that Darwin made trouble for himself. But Darwin was, I think, very aware that having a saltationist view implies metaphysical implications, especially after, I think, when the proteins and the code of DNA understood, arguing about some saltationist view as a hopeful monster of Goldschmidt, for example, as such a monster, it seems more metaphysical than it was before.
Well, it's also an impossibility.
Yes, but I think there is this the possibility. It is why I said that there is a possibility and fossil dilemma. But when we apply on micromutations, I think that, as I saw that, there should be many, many more intermediate fossils that it is hoped so. And I think it is why there is a something Stephen calls a punctuate equilibrium idea. I think it is the result of such, I think, a fossil problem. It occurred that because he tried to show, he tried to form in such a way a paleontological idea that I think it was very clever, in an irrefutable way, unfalsible way. Maybe let's say as in a Popperian view. It said that in some part, change occurs so fast that it is why we cannot find the fossil of that intermediate form. But I think by saying this, that he made a clever way of showing that why cannot people verify Darwinian micromutation idea.
Well,
But by doing so, I want to
let me try and answer them.
fall in the-
I'll get lost with all your points, if it's okay. Sure.
Okay.
No. Yeah. And I'll try and answer them quickly because there may be some other questions. But specifically, with the point about natural selection, it is more than likely that natural selection itself can only operate on a substrate of limited possibilities, and there's something which Ard and I are particularly interested in, along with other people, on what's called evolvability. In other words, we have, for instance, nice evidence of convergence in gene networks, so that's fine. The gene networks and mutational pathways only work in certain ways, and that in part explains why things are evolved so efficiently. So the problem in part is that much of the debate, so far as, for instance, intelligent design, but not only intelligent design, is again is on the basis of an extremely thin understanding of what evolution actually is. I mean, it's fine talking about natural selection, but I'm afraid evolution is a great deal more than natural selection happens to be the process, but there's a whole substrate upon which it works, and in part we don't understand what the possibilities of those substrates are. I'm not saying that natural selection explains everything. I don't think it does, but nevertheless it does seem to the mechanism of evolution. But if you're going to have a debate, especially with the creationists, I mean, as soon, not saying you're saying that at all, but as soon as they say, oh, it's all about natural selection, one has to say, well, no, it's a little bit more than that. So that's one aspect. Your other point, if again I can allude to it very briefly, is this is extremely controversial. It's a matter of discussion between card-carrying Darwinians, but for what it's worth, in my own view, macroevolution doesn't exist other than a perceived phenomenon. In other words, all processes are microevolutionary, and in particular the work I've done on the Cambrian explosion, where we're very interested in the origin of body plans, is that, in my opinion, with plenty of people who disagree with me, but in my opinion, I think we can now convincingly show how a number of different phyla evolved by intermediate steps. There is no jumping at all. And why should there be jumping? So you're quite right, if you want a hopeless monster, if you want the Goldschmidtian idea of these macro-mutational leaps, if you want Huxley's saltational aspects, if those actually were ever shown to work or to be found in the real world, then you might have a metaphysical viewpoint which we would think is in support of it. But the fact of the matter is that you can see things which appear to be oceans apart, but once you understand where they come from, using sometimes the fossil record, then you can actually see these things are gradual. And my own view is actually that saltational argument is dead and buried. It doesn't matter.
If you think that there are intermediate forms as such, why then Stefan Jay Gould, you think that he bring the punctuated equilibrium idea?
Because
what was the result
Stephen Jay Gould,
why he call it professional secret?
No.
for
Well,
example?
it was absolute rubbish. I mean, that was just rhetoric. I mean, you know,
It was his rhetoric.
it was his rhetoric, yeah, but we're entitled to call it rhetoric. And I mean, it was based on a rather complex individual, and in large part it was to do, I believe, I mean, I hope this is not out of context, but my understanding is that in part it was driven, quite frankly, by the horror of the Holocaust, because he had Jewish roots. And at that time, and of course there are plenty of other genocides we can add to that list, the whole thing from one perspective is completely unthinkable. It should never have happened. I mean, it's from one perspective, you cannot believe what happened. And so from that perspective, I think Gould thought this thing was so appalling, and in part some of the arguments had recruited an illegitimate biology to justify the genocide, and that's been done to the present day, I hasten to say, that it would be better if we could show beyond all reasonable doubt that humans in particular were completely free. In other words, they were complete accidents of evolution, and therefore had no imposition of any moral certainties or framework from any outside agency. So therefore, if we could make the best of world, and they say this is very much part of an Enlightenment project, and in its own way is very noble, but I think it's actually completely flawed. I don't think it'll work. You'll just keep on having genocide after genocide, but that's another story. So from that perspective, he was extremely anxious to show, in part on the basis of his own Marxist sympathies, that if you had a speciation process which involved a complete genomic collapse of the species, then a stasis, and then the idea this thing is eventually has irreconcilable problems with the surrounding environment, and so the genome disintegrates again in the way that Hegel argued effectively, and then was adopted, if I understand it correctly, by Marx. This was an extremely appealing program. There's only one thing wrong with it, and that is it's completely wrong. It's absolute rubbish. We know now how the genome evolved, and it doesn't evolve anything. Gould never understood developmental biology properly, and he certainly didn't understand the genome. But in part, the reason he didn't understand the genome is because at the stage he didn't understand the genome, nobody understood the genome.
So you think that the roots of the punctuated equilibrium idea is in some sense genocide then?
It's just nonsense. Punctuated equilibrium is dead. It was a hypothesis which was adopted on an ideological basis, was subject to reasonable testing, and hasn't stood the test of time.
Okay.
This is regarding convergence of a particular faculty amongst the different species. Suppose the singing in the whales. My simple question is, do you believe the whales understand their music? Because then we could be running into a problem if we say that they do understand their music, then we have to admit that they have their conscious world. But if we say that they do not understand, then the question is why they will be doing something which they don't understand.
Sure. No, I mean, certainly, I mean, if I understand you correctly, it is, if we presuppose that whales understand their music, then we presuppose that they have a consciousness. But on the other hand, if we presuppose it's unconscious, then we have to ask why they're bothering to do it in any particular way which has got a reflection on the complex music they produce. Now, again, no way am I entitled to talk about this. I know I have no. My guess would be they certainly do understand what they're doing. But of course, the question there is why do the males sing but the females don't sing, for example? But other whales show other patterns. But one hint that there is an understanding there is, and again, I know you can explain this from another perspective, but one hint is that in certain whale populations, they undergo what's called a sort of cultural revolution. In other words, a new song arrives, and that song takes over and becomes much more popular. And there's also evidence in killer whales in particular, they have various sorts of vocalizations, you actually see this in birds, which are effectively dialects. In other words, there are local preferences for particular sorts of communication. Now, all of that can be completely unconscious, but in part I think the problem is, as a way I was trying to hint with respect to the hominid lineage, one doesn't have any reason to think consciousness suddenly pops out of nowhere. I mean, it's presumably, even from a naturalistic perspective, an emergent phenomena. You know, the thing begins to become self-evident. Technologies we enjoy with books and music and long-term storage of data, then, you know, there's almost, I think, no end to what is now possible. Here are very much better qualified to talk about theory of mind and so forth. But the evidence in the crows is tantalizingly clear. Notions are much more difficult to study. You don't even know usually which individual's doing the singing. There are some work being done on this, in fact. Cultural transmission and cultural innovation of songs in some of the whales, that at least is consistent.
Some faculty, is there any paradigm in which what we understand as natural selection could be termed as unnatural? In the sense, there was a group of, I think the people in the robotics field who betray. Yeah, betrayal.
Oh, sorry, yes, right.
Now, the thing is that I do not know of any other species where betrayal is kind of, common thing or not so common thing.
Yeah.
Now, if we think that, that there are, so suppose there is a one species where there is no betrayal and the value system is, suppose, love and compassion,
Mm-hmm.
then they could be thinking that the natural selection by which Homo sapiens or human beings developed is kind of unnatural, and
see,
we
yeah.
are the natural.
Right, okay. Well, yeah, thank you. It's more or less, I think it's a fair summary of what you're saying, is that if one is engaged in various ethical decisions, like betrayal or cheating or adultery, or whatever your favorite example might be, then the extent to which that is unnatural, if you like, in terms of the wider biological context. Again, I'm no authority on this at all. I mean, my sense is, well, there are two slightly opposite views. I mean, first of all, I do actually myself object to the importing of words like cheating, for instance, when you're talking about a bacterial system, because cheating to us has a very strong moral framework. And even though one bacterium might be getting something relatively for nothing, we don't really have a language to describe that. I mean, cheating, I think, is not necessarily the word one wants to use. But it's also the case, I think, that approximately the roots of altruistic behaviour can be seen in animals. I don't think that should particularly surprise us. What is much less apparent, and again, in fact, if I go back, if I just return on these, come on, don't be shy. Yeah, to the example here. One would imagine, in fact, at least amongst the descendants of this form, they had some quite advanced social patterns and behaviour and support for people who are very, very ill indeed, even though they may not have had fully fledged language. And in that sort of aspect, one can see that there are the rudiments of altruistic behaviour really quite deep into at least the mammals and arguably the birds. But on the other hand, and I have no answer for this at all, what we regard as our fully fledged, but at least our fledged ethical systems, whereby one has a very complex set of reciprocations, which may well be based on a divine mandate which is imported from outside that set of ethics, or indeed reflects it in some sort of way. How that transformation is made, I'm far from clear. I know there are naturalistic explanations, especially for the origins of religion. Darwin's Cathedral, for instance, is one such book, which I think is actually very seriously flawed for a number of reasons, but one certainly should attempt that explanation because one has to be a scientist about these sorts of things. But I would rather take the view that ultimately there is a universal ethic, and the fact that we discover that ethic indeed is a reflection of the universality of that ethic, which is technically a circular argument, but nevertheless is something whereby one can see when things go wrong, how badly wrong they go.
And the last question is from that graph, the chimpanzee and the humans and endocranial volume. Percentage of adult endocranial volume, if we take that as one of the criterion, is it okay to say that at some point early chimpanzee could be more or equally intelligent as early human being?
Well, given that we came from something which was similar but not identical to a chimpanzee, in a sense the question's answered. We are that, if you like. But I think the problem now, possibly, I don't know, is that once you have the humans here, whose brain size is only sort of reaches completion about the age of 12, I suppose, thereabouts, then all bets are off.
Okay, so
of course, there's overwhelming evidence for evolution, but you also agree with the critique that sometimes there is a commitment to see evidence for evolution where there is not, like in the cases of Haeckel's embryos or the Peppermint story, which didn't turn out to be that way, or sometimes just overlook some facts which are not compatible. And I think Cambrian explosion itself might be, as I know of the story, if it's true, Charles Walcott, founded the Burgess Shale in the beginning of the century, but he didn't like it for some time, and it was rediscovered again, by paleontologists like you. So is there, besides seeing some facts for evolution and just inferring those facts, is there also an ideological commitment to neo-Darwinism for some philosophical reasons, and which sometimes results in making some wrong conclusions or some overlooking some evidence which might look contrary to Darwinian evolution? That's a critique, I wonder if there is any grain of salt in your point of view in that critique.
Well, thank you. I think just as a part of local history, I obviously never knew Walcott by definition because he died long before I was born, but the impression I get about both reading his papers and such other information as his biographies is that by a guy called Ellis Jockelson, is that I don't think Walcott was ever particularly interested in any of these particular evolutionary questions. Walcott was basically a stratigrapher. He was interested in the order of the rocks and so forth, and I'm sure he would have accepted evolution in a rather sort of vague fashion, not vague in a sense, but I don't think he was particularly fascinated. So far as the Burgess Shale was concerned, what he stumbled across, of course, was a treasure trove of material. And of course, there's been, as you know, a great deal of discussion as to how we interpret those sorts of things. And again, Gould has added his thoughts to that particular area. But our understanding of the Cambrian explosion owes everything to Walcott in terms of the discovery of the fossils, but owes absolutely nothing to him in terms of his thinking of the fossils. And I don't want to divert the conversation too much away from your general point, which is extremely important. But to the first approximation, as I think I mentioned earlier, I mean, partly my work, but that of also my colleagues, is that we now have a sufficient understanding of the supposedly enigmatic fossils. And I freely admit I made all sorts of mistakes myself, and particularly glorious ones, in fact. We had a paper published in Science about a month ago where we're arguing about the origin of a particular group known as the ctenophores, who's ever heard of them. And nobody in the world believes us at the moment. We may well be wrong, but nevertheless we do have a hypothesis which suggests that something which has remained almost completely enigmatic in terms of its origin as a phylum, we now have a coherent hypothesis for. Now, I don't care, frankly, two hoots whether I'm right or wrong.
Which phylum is that?
Ctenophores, the sea gooseberries, the comb jellies. And a very, very interesting group indeed. Quite primitive, very distinctive architecture. And when I'm sorry, I should have thought to throw one in. When you look at the architecture of these things, which basically they're like small footballs, and they have 8 rows of fused cilia, and you think, where on earth did they come from? You know, of all the phyla, that, you know, they are completely isolated. There's nothing else like them at all. They're fairly close to the corals molecularly, but, you know, but as I say, we think we have an answer which involves the Ediacaran fauna. So, could be wrong. But, you know, that thing is achieved by gradual steps. There's no macro evolution there at all, because we now have the evidence. But your more important point, which you have to be very careful how I would choose to answer it, is of course all of us have ideologies, all of us have metaphysics, of course we do. But the point about science, especially in terms of evolution, is that it doesn't actually make a scrap of difference whether, for the sake of argument, I was Christian or atheist or Muslim or Hindu. All of us would interpret those fossils effectively in the same way. We'd all be looking at the same evidence. And that's true of all science. It may well be a product of Western imagination to start with, but it's now a human universal. And that is crucially important when you're trying to find out truths about the natural world. So yes, I have my own ideologies. Why else would I be interested in the origins of consciousness? I'm quite happy that I have a metaphysic of invisible aspects of the world. I don't think the three-dimensional world we have around is by any means a complete explanation. But at the moment we don't have a science which can possibly deal with that sort of approach. But if you go and talk to Aquinas, no problem. The thinking's being done.
Thank you for the very interesting information about the mental world of birds. I didn't know anything about it. I was just wondering if the convergence you pointed out is also part of our making, because in a certain sense we are looking for behavior similar to our own behavior in birds, or at least behavior we are able to interpret. And I would think that it would be possible that there is also behavior which seems completely irrational or chaotic or completely uninteresting in birds, which would be part of their mental world. Are there mechanisms to control this kind of difficulty?
That's a difficult question, principally because I don't know enough about the behavior of birds generally, far from it. What I think, first of all, is significant is that the groups we're dealing with are the ones which, on our metric, seem to be the cleverest. They're the ones which make the tools, for instance. And you can say, well, that's an extremely anthropomorphic view. And I'm not to say that there are other groups of birds which don't, in their own way, have rich lives which make local sense to them in their habitats. You know, that's perfectly reasonable. But I don't think there's any case that I can readily think of where the behavior in any useful way could be described as chaotic, or if you like, irrational. They may well make an irrational decision because they don't have enough information. And in point of fact, in the dolphins, there's another nice example of convergence, because they show from various studies that they have something very similar to our dither factor. No, you don't know what to, you're not quite sure what to do. You know, will I do this? Will I do that? You know, you've got two alternatives, both almost equally attractive, and you tend to. And sometimes with children, it can be literally fatal because they don't have enough understanding in the outside world as to what the real threat is. So they see two things, one of which is truly lethal and the other one is trivial, and they don't know which way. You know, that sort of example. You stand in the middle of the road, and a car is coming towards you, but at the same time, a tree is about to fall on you. So you dither. What on earth am I going to do? Well, I let the tree fall on me, I let the car hit on me. Because if you're grown up, you probably know enough about the falling of a tree and the speed of the car to make the appropriate action, but a child wouldn't. So I'm sure, you know, that and I'm not for a moment imagining that, you know, all animals live in the same world any more than all of us live in the same world. You know, there's no reason not to have a series of worlds, and most importantly, what encourages most of all about theology is that you're now invited to discover world after world after world. Any one world may encapsulate another world, but each world you enter is richer than the world which you've then understood. And I think effectively that's what interests me about these other areas. But there is an anthropomorphic risk in a sense, just saying, you know, giving them a metaphorical pat on the beak and saying, well done, you know, you're almost us, which of course would not be the point. I don't know if that answers your question fairly, but...
While we've got this up, I just would like to ask you, please, about development of the human brain. You were saying 12 years, you would get to 100%. That's in volume terms. I don't know if other things happened in the brain besides it getting bigger. So the first question is, after the 100% volume, does that mean all the connections and, you know, all the physical entities and all the rest of it is there? It'll be replicated regularly, but is the basic structure there, and that's the end of it. And the other question was, I understand that lots of interconnections are developing as you grow, and these are crucial to your emotional well-being as a person in later life. Could you give us some indication on the time scale, as far as people know, as to how one's emotional development in terms of that time scale? Is that because this has big implications in terms of people's well-being for the rest of their lives. In other words, are we determined in effect by 12? That's what I'm asking.
No, I don't. I'm sorry. I mean, the question is the extent to which one is locked into a particular system, whereby once one's got a brain of a certain size in completion of one's ontogeny, one's early growth, that then, you know, things can no longer change. I'm again, there are other experts here who know a great deal more about it, but my understanding is, to the first approximation, quite a degree of flexibility remains in your brain in certain aspects, and otherwise we would never be able to teach undergraduates. So some people say, well, we don't, but that's another story. And you'll see people, but you know, but by and large, if you want to learn the piano, it's a very good idea to start around about here rather than my age, as my father, bless him, found out. But correspondingly, you know, so far as things are concerned, I mean, things I think probably start around about 20 days. You know, and there's a lot of evidence now of sort of, you know, in utero influence on child development, and anybody who's had the pleasure and love of seeing their own children growing up through this amazing period between here and here will know that, all things being equal, the right environment is central for their emotional health for the rest of their lives. But sometimes some children have terrible experiences and come out of it not too bad. We'd have to, because otherwise we'd be hopeless. That's my reading, but again, you know, there are experts here who know far more about this.
Does Warren or Peter want to come in at all on this? Mike, we need the mic. Yeah.
So I daren't speak about these. I just don't know enough about it.
It's relevant to that grant. The most important thing about the human brain probably is, in terms of social development, it's slow development. And the frontal areas of the brain, which I'll talk a little about later, are still myelinating out past the age of 20. Right. So there's still developmental processes that are going on physically, and then the whole process of incorporation of life experience goes on through memory throughout your life. So.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, we've got time for one more question. Yes, Christine.
Yes, about this graph, I am struck to see the difference of behavior, if I can say like that, of the two curves. And there is something surprising, well, I don't know if it is surprising, but in this general scheme of a general tendency of brain growing over the years or millions of years, it is striking to see that among the Homo erectus, it was quite stable, and they didn't change very much their endocranial capacity for about 1 million years. And it is only Homo sapiens, a small tribe apparently from South Africa or East Africa, which had such an increase and such a rapid increase of the brain.
I'm sorry, I don't have much of the information at my fingertips. I don't think the stasis in brain size is as pronounced as that. There is a fairly steady increase. It is, I mean, there are so many problems. I mean, the record is incomplete. The dating, even the dating of this Merger-Curto skull. Actually, there have been some recent papers, and there's some uncertainty. It could be 1.8, it could be 1.2. So there's a lot of problems there, and estimating relative brain sizes, but. Overall, the sense I get, I could be easily wrong about this, is overall it's a pretty steady linear increase, but there are times of relative acceleration. I'm not aware of any particular period of complete stasis, so far as I know.
Stasis?
Of brain size. I don't think...
It is not really a stasis, but a slow growth. And the growth of Homo sapiens is more rapid.
I know. Well, again, I'd have to spend a happy afternoon in the Haddon Library getting up to date in our Arcananth library here. But by and large, I mean, fully fledged Homo sapiens is alive and well 200,000 years ago with a brain size identical to ours. It takes them apparently another 100,000 years to learn how to make necklaces, and there's actually been some very recent data just published from Israel which has pushed that a little bit back. But even so, there's maybe a lack of information. It may be that other things didn't cohere, and it may be partly the social organisation of these relatively small tribes. Nobody knows at the moment. But as far as I'm aware, there isn't a particular eureka point on the increase in brain size of either the Homo sapiens or the hominin, as we're meant to call it, hominin lineage, whereby suddenly things change. I don't think so. But I should say in parenthesis, of course, and I'm sure many of you realised, having talked a little bit about the Homo florensis, of which there's probably a descendant of Homo erectus, just because it falls on the chimpanzee ontogenetic trajectory does not mean that it's got a brain which is of that of a chimpanzee. And that is something which I should have really made clear earlier on.
Good. Well, I think we've worked Simon very, very hard this morning, and he's given us a tremendous amount of information, lots of things to think about, and I think we really need to thank him very warmly indeed for...
Thank you, Bob.